Thank you. The next item of business is debate on motion 20716 in the name of Murdo Fraser on no case for tax increases or further cuts to public spending. Can invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. And I say before we start, we have some time in hand for interventions. And I call on Murdo Fraser to speak to and move the motion. Mr Fraser, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Tomorrow, the Finance Secretary will set out his budget for the coming financial year. It is the highlight of my year, Presiding Officer, and I think we're all looking forward to that occasion. And we felt it would be a good opportunity, therefore, this afternoon to set out what we believe his budget priorities should be and to allow those in other parties to set out their own thoughts. Now, I'm not so naive as to think that what is said in this debate will necessarily influence the Finance Secretary's thinking ahead of tomorrow. Indeed, I fully expect his budget documents to be on the way to the printers already, if indeed that's not the case. However, tomorrow is just the start of the budget process. And over the next 4 weeks that follow, there will require to be discussion, scrutiny and negotiation. So this is today us setting out our stall. And I hope this will be a positive and constructive debate. And who knows, we might be able to find a degree of consensus about our collective priorities for the budget for the coming year. Let me start, Presiding Officer, by setting out a little about the backdrop to this year's budget. I appreciate that with the UK budget not being delivered until the 11th of March, we do not have precise figures as yet to inform our own budget settlement. Nevertheless, there is a great deal of information already in the public domain which enables the Finance Secretary to go ahead and put forward proposals to Parliament. That is what the Welsh Government did, and indeed they presented their budget proposals to the Welsh Assembly back in December. So let no one pretend that the timing of the UK budget made it impossible for the Finance Secretary to bring forward his own budget plans. Indeed, historically, Scottish budgets were presented in September, well ahead of UK budgets in March of the following year, and the current fiscal framework was negotiated and agreed by the Scottish Government against precisely that backdrop. So I hope we will hear no more faux outrage from the SNP about budget timings. We do know from spending decisions already made that the block grant from Westminster will grow by at least £1.1 billion in real terms from this year to the next. According to the Fraser of Allender Institute, that amounts to a 2.1% real terms increase. This Boris bonus gives the Finance Secretary considerable extra money to spend. However, Presiding Officer, that is not the entirety of the picture, because the block grant requires to be adjusted in two respects. Firstly, we know we are carrying forward a negative reconciliation of approximately £200 million due to an overestimate of tax revenues made by the Scottish Government from 3 years ago. On top, well, if the Finance Secretary want to intervene and explain to me why that's not true, I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Does Murdo Fraser not understand or indeed know that the tax forecasts are set by the Scottish Fiscal Commission and not the Scottish Government?
Well,
Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, I regret to tell the Finance Secretary he is wrong, because the overestimate I referred to was in fact an estimate set by the Scottish Government before the Fiscal Commission took on that responsibility. He doesn't even understand his own brief, Presiding Officer. So we are carrying forward that £200 million reconciliation. On top of that, there's also likely to be a negative impact. The Scottish income tax receipts are not expected to grow as much as in the rest of the UK, according to the most recent Fiscal Commission set of forecasts. And of course, we will get the updates to these tomorrow. And according to the Fraser of Allender Institute, these factors combined take the block grant growth down from 2.1% in real terms to just 1%. In other words, and to put it bluntly, more than half of the benefit of the Boris bonus coming to Scotland from Westminster is being lost because of this government's inability to grow income tax revenues at least the UK average rate. In a second, the ability for us to fund our public services is being damaged because our economy is not growing fast enough. Mr Mason.
John Mason.
I thank Mr Fraser for giving way. We do accept that it wasn't entirely the government that was involved in this, but HMRC did not know how many Scottish taxpayers there were, who was a Scottish taxpayer and how much tax they were paying.
Murdo Fraser.
Mr Mason makes a reasonable point in relation to the original forecast of tax revenues, but the point I'm making is that for the forecast now, we have much better information, and you cannot blame the relative drop in income tax receipts on a forecasting error, when in fact is the inability of our economy to grow fast enough, or at least in line with the UK average. Now, Presiding Officer, we should never forget in all these discussions that Scotland benefits from a union dividend now worth nearly £2,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. That is the value of the fiscal transfer coming from the rest of the United Kingdom to support higher public spending in Scotland than is possible elsewhere. And that payment does not arise primarily because the Scottish economy is performing worse than the UK average, although that is a factor, but substantially because of much higher public spending levels here than elsewhere in the UK. And SNP members who want to draw a comparison between public spending rates in Scotland compared to those south of the border, as they often do, need to be honest with people that if we went down the route of independence that they propose, all that benefit would be lost. And they have absolutely no idea how to make up that difference and how that fiscal transfer of more than £10 billion would be replaced. Now, Presiding Officer, looking forward to the budget tomorrow, we've already set out our position on what the Finance Secretary's priorities should be, and I will spell them out again to this chamber. With the Boris bonus and increases in the block grant, there can be no justification for any additional tax rises or further cuts to public spending. And we have put forward a set of measured proposals. We have fully costed these at let me just make some progress. We have fully costed these at some £777 million. Now, I was rather surprised, therefore, to see in the government's amendment to this debate that they are claiming our proposals will cost more than double that, at £1.5 billion. Presiding Officer, this is fake news. Fake news from the people who brought you the 2014 Independence White Paper, who promised an oil price of $110 a barrel, who said we could set up a whole new country for the sum of £200 million. You can't trust a word they say, Presiding Officer. Financial illiteracy seems to be a qualification to be in this government, and talking of financial illiteracy, I'll give way to the Finance Minister.
I just wondered if the member would be willing to publish his costings and associated lines.
Absolutely delighted to do that. I will pass that across the chamber to the Finance Minister right now. Now, Presiding Officer, so the two areas we view as priorities for this budget are, firstly, measures to grow the Scottish economy, and secondly, support for vital public services. And we will assess any budget proposals from the SNP government against these priorities. Let me deal firstly with the question of income tax. Over the past 2 years, as a consequence of the Finance Secretary's nefarious deals with the Green Party, Scotland has become the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom, with everyone earning over £27,000 per annum paying more income tax than those in the rest of the UK. To put this in simple terms, it means that public servants, such as police sergeants, senior nurse managers and principal teachers, are now paying more in tax than their counterparts south of the border, in some cases over £1,500 a year more. Now, the SNP will argue that these tax increases are justified because they are supporting better public services in Scotland. But the reality is somewhat different. And it was confirmed in the evidence given by Mary Spowage, who is the Deputy Director of the Fraser of Allender Institute, given to the Finance and Constitution Committee just last week. Because what she confirmed was that the additional tax raised by these changes to rates and bans has been offset by reductions in income tax more generally because of slower overall income tax growth in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. And to quote her directly, she said this: "Looking ahead, the effect of higher tax rates in Scotland is broadly cancelled out by the fact that the outlook for wage growth in Scotland is slower than the rest of the UK." So in other words, Presiding Officer, if we grew the economy in Scotland at just the same rate as the UK average, if we grew income tax receipts at the same as the rest of the UK, there would be no need whatsoever for these income tax differentials, and we'd be raising the same amount of money. And this evidence from the Fraser of Allender Institute, the very respected Fraser of Allender Institute, Presiding Officer, gives the lie to the notion that better public services in Scotland can only be supported by higher tax rates. In reality, the same outcome can be achieved by a growth in the economy and the growth in the tax take. Now, Mr Rennie caught my eye first, so I'll give way to him.
Willie Rennie.
I hear what he says, but therefore I'm confused as to why his motion today and his budget proposals implicitly support that tax rise by refusing to reverse it. Why is that? Can you clear that mess up?
I'm very
Member
grateful
Fraser.
to that intervention of Mr Rennie. I was just going to come on and make precisely that point. So he's given me a cue to do that. Because I would dearly love the Finance Secretary in this forthcoming budget to reverse his tax increases. But I am realistic enough to know that is unlikely to happen. So at the very least, what we want to see is no further divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Now, we don't know, of course, at this point, what the Chancellor has in mind for income tax south of the border, and we won't know that until the 11th of March. But I think it is reasonable to expect that thresholds will be uprated in line with inflation, and that is the least we would expect from the Finance Secretary here. And we would not want to see the benefit of any tax cut following on from an increase in the threshold for paying national insurance, which would of course benefit workers in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, being clawed back by higher tax rates from the Finance Secretary here. Now, income tax is not the only tax lever under the Finance Secretary's control. Yesterday, we had a long debate about business rates, and we'll be returning to that later this afternoon. And we believe this is a system in need of comprehensive reform. In the short term, we suggest two measures at a minimum. Firstly, the reduction in the large business supplement, which penalises Scotland by being set at a rate double that of the rest of the UK, to at least the same level paying elsewhere. And secondly, the retention of all existing reliefs, including the small business bonus, and those reliefs proposed to be removed as part of the current non-domestic rates bill. And in addition, we are very clear that we would not support any new taxes or levies being imposed in this budget, so no more daft ideas like the hated car park tax put forward by the Greens last year. No, thank you. I need to make some progress. When it comes to spending, my colleagues will later in this debate set out in detail our priorities for the public services. But let me say briefly that when it comes to the NHS, we want to see all Barnett consequentials arising from increased health spending in England being passed on to the NHS in Scotland. Within this envelope, we want to see a new hospital parking charges refund scheme, whereby for the 3 hospitals in Scotland still charging for parking, Glasgow Royal Infirmary, Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and Nine Wells, there is a refund for hospital staff and the development of a new scheme for protected groups who need it most, including disabled patients and parents of sick children staying overnight. We want to see an end to the underfunding of NHS boards and the delivery of NRAC funding parity. And to tackle one of our nation's greatest failures in the area of public policy, a dramatic increase in the number of drug rehabilitation beds funded by a new £15.4 million scheme, replacing the 80% cut in the number of rehab beds under this SNP government. Presiding Officer, local government has in recent years borne the brunt of budget cuts from this SNP government, with a 7.6% real terms cut in revenue funding since 2013. We see the impact on this on local communities right across Scotland. We cannot have another year of cuts. As a minimum, the core funding for local government needs to be increased in line with inflation, and all the additional extra commitments that have been put on local councils, totalling £497 million, funded in full, along with all new or additional commitments fully funded. Presiding Officer, in the field of justice, we have recently heard from the Chief Constable about his worries about cuts to their budget, and we're asking for a minimum extra £50 million to protect 750 police officer roles. We want to see revenue funding for higher education protected, at least in real terms, and a 2% real terms increase in capital funding for that sector. And on housing, we want to see an additional £10 million for an expansion of the Ending Homelessness Together Fund on the very day when we've learnt about the dramatic increase in the number of deaths of homeless people. Presiding Officer, what I have set out today and what is in our motion does not represent the totality of what we want to see from this budget, nor does it represent what a Conservative budget might look like. But it sets out some of the priority areas for us and areas we believe the Scottish Government should be addressing if they want to win our support for their budget in the coming weeks. This package of proposals is not unrealistic, nor is it unduly radical. It represents a credible and affordable package which can be delivered within the overall financial envelope available to the Scottish Government in the coming year. I hope they will sit down and work with us in coming weeks to deliver a budget which prioritises growing the economy, expanding our tax revenues and supporting our vital services. We are open to doing just that with them. I hope they will respond in kind, and I have pleasure in moving the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Fraser. And I call on Kate Forbes to speak to move amendment 20716.4. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Why do the budget debate once when you can do it 3, 4 or 5 times? And, delighted to be here again talking about the budget, which is of course published tomorrow, and it's published in the context of unprecedented uncertainty, because the decision of the UK Government to defer the UK budget from the 6th of November to the 11th of March means that we still do not have the certainty that we might normally have when publishing our budget for the coming year. And we've been forced to hold our budget ahead of the UK Government's budget in order to provide that clarity that local authorities, third sector organisations and ratepayers expect. But without the UK's tax and spending decisions and the updated fiscal forecasts, we do not have as much clarity available on public services as we would like in Scotland. However, I do think it's a point worth making that with the Scottish Government's budget going first, before the UK Government budget, then I can only assume that the Tories' call for no tax divergence is in fact targeted at the UK Government, who will have the opportunity to replicate the Scottish Government's decisions in order to reduce that divergence. Now, as a responsible government, we have a duty to balance our budget this year, as we have done every previous year. We're well aware of the challenges that the Fraser of Allender Institute has set out. And of course, it's worth reflecting on the points that have repeatedly been made by the Conservatives about the so-called Boris bonus. Because, of course, since 2010, the Scottish Government's budget in terms of day-to-day spending has fallen. That is the reality of UK Government funding over that last decade. And I don't think even Murdo Fraser would argue that this year's potential increase in funding reverses a decade of austerity that the Scottish Government has had to operate within. By contrast, the Scottish Government has taken action to deliver certainty for our public services. And you see that, for example, in local government funding, where COSLA's spokesperson on finance said that councils in Tory-run England and Labour-run Wales were, and I quote, collapsing. Whereas in Scotland, we see local government working in partnership with the Scottish Government to ensure that the people of Scotland receive the services that they expect. So, moving on to the specifics that have been raised by other members so far in the amendments and also in the comments. We recognise that tomorrow is an important day. It's important in order to provide that clarity and also to continue the theme that this government has been developing over the last few years in terms of ensuring that our partners in local authorities are protected from the austerity that we have been on the receiving end of. The Cabinet Secretary for Finance will announce his tax policy proposals in tomorrow's budget, and of course I won't be drawn on those today, but we continue to ensure that Scotland is the fairest and most progressive taxed part of the UK. And in fact, since the Fraser of Allender Institute has been quoted so consistently in every budget debate, it's worth commenting that last year the Fraser of Allender's analysis of our tax position was, and I quote, "We estimate that the Scottish income tax policy raises approximately around £550 million in revenue compared to a policy to set the same tax parameters as in the UK." So the question for the Conservatives, yes, the question for the Conservatives would be where the Tories would have cut in order to meet that £500 million shortfall in the last year.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. On that very point, I wonder if would she accept the point made in evidence last week to the Finance and Constitution Committee by the Fraser of Allender Institute, who she just quoted, the fact being that the tax rate increases put forward by the Scottish Government have had no net beneficial impact on the Scottish income tax receipts, because if we had grown income tax receipts in line with growth at the UK average, there'd be no need for these tax rises at all.
Minister.
I think it's worth reflecting on 2 points. The first is that with the devolution of tax-raising powers at the beginning, there are going to be questions about reconciliation. There inevitably will be around forecasting. But the point remains the same, that the Conservatives have taken a stance consistently in every budget over the last few years that they wanted to prioritise tax cuts for the highest earners. That remains a fact. It's a fact that Murdo Fraser has repeated in his opening statement, that their position is to ensure that there are tax cuts for the highest earners. The question then for balancing a budget is, where do those tax cuts fall, because inevitably it will mean a reduction in finance for our public services. And at a time when there is economic challenge, and consistently businesses identify Brexit and other things as being a reason for facing this economic challenge, there is a question of where those tax would fall. And we have prioritised the lowest earners and funding our public services. So 55% of Scottish taxpayers are paying less income tax than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK as a result of the policy decisions that this government has made. And we have made choices in last year's budget that raised additional revenue to support our vital public services and our economy, and we will do the same again tomorrow. Now, the vast majority of businesses, as well as income tax payers in Scotland, already pay less than they would elsewhere in the UK. So, in fact, the rhetoric that comes from the Conservatives about the highest tax part of the UK is actually more damaging than the reality and the substance of the budget. Now, moving on briefly to a number of other points. In terms of the budget, this year the Scottish Government is investing in excess of £14 billion in health and care services, and we've continued to pass on every penny of health resource consequentials. We will continue to do that. And in terms of ensuring that every part of Scotland is protected in terms of health spending, that has been a priority of this government, and that is why health spending is at a record high. Murdo Fraser mentioned hospital parking, the irony being, of course, that it was this government that abolished car parking charges at NHS-owned car parks, so that patients, visitors and staff over that time have saved over £39 million. And in fact, when it comes to a number of other areas, consistently, there is a higher performance in Scotland than the rest of the UK. So I'm delighted that tomorrow it won't be a Conservative budget that we are looking at. It will be an SNP government budget, which ensures that despite all the challenges and uncertainties we face, most of which are caused by the UK government, we will continue to deliver our vision. Our vision is for a successful Scotland which puts health, which puts prosperity, which puts well-being at its heart, whilst at the same time tackling some of the big challenges we face. Yeah.
Miles Briggs.
Before taking this intervention, can she confirm today then that we will not see any more cuts to drug and alcohol budgets by this SNP government, like we've seen?
Minister.
I look forward to the member participating in tomorrow's budget, and of course I'm not going to confirm anything that's in tomorrow's budget, but he can look at our track record in terms of prioritising money going to the front line. And so, Presiding Officer, as I draw to a close, I'm more than delighted to hear the other parties participating in the budget process, and it makes a nice change from previous years when they've just sat on the fence.
Absolutely.
Please move your amendment.
I move the amendment.
Thank you. And I now call Rhoda Grant to speak to and move amendment 20716.1. Ms Grant, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Austerity has caused untold harm to our communities. Surely none of us come into politics to see a world where families are dependent on food banks, where malnutrition is an ever-present danger, and where our communities are suffering with no safety net. A generation of young people growing up who will be worse off than their parents. It's the aim, surely, of every generation to leave a better world for their children. The Scottish Government must help deliver this ambition. Austerity has a devastating effect on the economy as well. Poverty is on the rise, with child poverty targets going unmet. Communities are failing to thrive, high street shops are dwindling, libraries are closing, class sizes increasing, social care reaching crisis point. In addition, the gig economy is on the rise, where people have no choice but to accept low-paid, exploitative, unstable jobs. Austerity was a political choice. The poorest in our society have suffered most. Our society divisions between the haves and have-nots have grown. We need real change. We're realistic, and we know that one budget will not reverse over a decade's worth of cuts. However, we need to start putting forward spending plans which will invest in our communities, economy and services, putting our money where it will make the most impact. This budget is being set against a backdrop of a climate emergency. We ignore this at our peril, and there is real fear that our response will further widen divisions within our economy. that those in a privileged position will capitalise on changes while the most vulnerable in our society will be left further behind. We need to ensure that government spending is carried out through a prism of a just transition. We need to address this emergency, but that should not be at the expense of those who are struggling now. Those who can afford it invest in insulation, invest in heat pumps and photovoltaics. Those who cannot afford it, these measures face rising bills and increasing fuel poverty. Therefore, everything we do must address climate change, but at the same time protect those most vulnerable in our communities and capitalise on the economic opportunities. On that point.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. I'm glad that the member agrees that a climate emergency budget is necessary and that public investment has to be forthcoming. Is it now the position of the Labour Party to support the proposition that there are unsustainable, traffic-inducing projects in the Scottish Government's programme where money should be directed away from those and into more sustainable projects?
Rhoda Grant.
That leads me nicely on to one of the interventions that we're proposing, and that is to see free bus travel for the under-25s. It would not only increase the use of public transport, but would mean that more buses are available to benefit us all. It would also form patterns of behaviour that young people would carry into adulthood, and this will reduce the number of polluting car journeys that are made. Free bus travel will of course benefit young people by opening up new opportunities, enabling them to attend work and after-school activities. It's a classic invest to save policy. We get young people onto buses and protect our planet, but we also allow them to be more economically active, boosting our economy and our coffers. Scottish Labour delivered free bus travel for older people, which has been a huge success, leaving people active as they get older, moving people out of their cars and onto buses when they're able to make that change. And it also means that they don't become isolated when they're no longer able to drive. Presiding Officer, the SNP government have turbocharged Tory austerity on councils. Since 2013, local government has faced the brunt of cuts. Their total revenue funding decreasing by 7%, while the Scottish governments have shouldered a 2% cut to their revenue budget. The Local Government Benchmark Framework National Benchmark Overview Report for the period 2018-19 stated, Scottish local government is now operating in a more challenging setting with greater demand for services against a tightening budget, with improvements achieved in previous years starting to stall. The data does highlight that with the status quo, there is a risk to the future delivery of key services. Councils are delving into their reserves, raising questions as to how they will cope delivering services and maintaining momentum as they have gained without a change in funding. I'm quite short of time and I have a number of points I wish to make. Presiding Officer, this has an impact on lifeline services and in turn on the most vulnerable people in our communities. Many councils are reduced to providing statutory services instead of being able to bring on frontline services protecting our communities. Councils have lost 40,000 jobs since 2007, a level of job losses that would have been unacceptable in any other sector. In this budget, they are expected to deliver additional services to the tune of 497 million, and they therefore must receive a fair settlement to allow them to deliver these additional services and invest in our communities as well. They must be enabled to deliver care in the community. The failure to tackle the social care crisis and the critical underfunding of local authorities continues to put pressure on the wider healthcare system. People fit to go back to the comfort of their own homes to recover are instead stuck in hospitals. How soul-destroying, knowing that you could be home where you would be more comfortable, but are instead stuck in hospital where visiting hours are restrictive and there is a higher risk of infection and you feel most vulnerable. The Scottish Government set up integrated joint boards to try and deal with this. Sadly, all it appears to have achieved is the creation of an additional layer of bureaucracy without the checks and balances faced by health boards and local government. And many of these IGBs are already in deficit. And this isn't getting better, as the latest figures from ISD show that in December 2019, 45,404 bed days were spent in hospital by patients who are medically fit to leave, a 6% increase on the same month in 2018. Since Jean Freeman assumed office as Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, the cost to health boards of delayed discharge has reached a shocking total of £197.8 million. However, local government and social care are not alone in bearing the brunt of cuts. Tuition fee income, which universities can generate from international students and those living in the rest of the UK, has replaced the Scottish Funding Council grants as the single biggest source of income in Scottish universities. Our college has also faced a sustained lack of investment. They are the institutions that provide in-work learning. Our economy is in danger if we don't train people in robotics and digital technologies. These technologies will impact on every aspect of industry.
And there, I'm afraid you must conclude and move your amendment.
I will just move to my conclusion then, Presiding Officer. Our budget requests are realistic.
Thank you.
And
No,
I move
no.
I move the amendment
really,
in
yes,
my name.
You've moved it. You need to sit down. I've given you time for your intervention. I now call Patrick Harvard, followed by Willie Rennie. I have very little time in hand now for interventions. Patrick Harvey.
I've consistently argued, Presiding Officer, that opposition parties, all opposition parties, should engage constructively with the budget process by putting forward positive ideas. I think that would be good for Parliament and good for the country. And so I welcome the fact that most parties are now doing so. It's hard to remember sometimes, but that's how our process was meant to work. And it's how modern pluralistic parliaments, which result from fair voting systems, operate across most of Europe. And I think that we should try to recapture the spirit that was intended when this Parliament was designed. There's now only one party holding out against that constructive agenda by lodging an amendment in response to a motion about the budget, which talks about federalism and a tired old no NDREF position. There seems to be no attempt there to develop a solid proposition about changes to the budget, but most political parties, the Labour and Conservative position, is now at least moving toward that more positive engagement. So let's look at those positions. There are some things in the Conservative motion that I think we could all welcome. More spending on drug services and on homelessness, for example, even though we acknowledge that they'll only be most effective if we can secure change from the UK in terms of its failed drug policy and many of the economic policies still pushing people into poverty and making them more vulnerable. But the spending on those services, I think most of us would welcome. But does the Tory proposition in general add up? Assuming that the UK government does grudgingly turn on the spending taps just a fraction after 10 years of austerity, there might be a bit more money available overall and some choices for the Scottish Government to make. But can we commit to follow the UK government's choices with Barnett consequentials and commit to new spending in our own priority areas and commit to an increase in local government revenues and commit to cut taxes for businesses? The Tories want all of this, and of course it cannot all be delivered at the same time. And while most of us agree that investing in high-quality public services is a good thing in principle and something we'd like to increase, I can't accept the implication of the opening phrase in the motion that tax in itself is a bad thing in principle and something that should always be minimised. Tax is not only about raising revenue adequate to meet our investment in services. It's also about achieving behaviour change. It's about redistribution of wealth to achieve a more fair and equal society. And yes, there is good evidence that high rates of income tax at the very top end act as a disincentive to excessive pay demands by the super rich. These are all positive objectives, and tax has a positive role in principle. As for the previous tax changes to income tax, Murdo Fraser knows very well that the Fraser of Allender did reject the idea that changes in the income tax base are the result of changes in the income tax rate. If we followed his policy, we'd still see a huge revenue gap regardless of changes in earnings. And if either he or the Liberal Democrats want to reverse the 1819 shift to a fairer five-band system, it can only be done through tax cuts for the highest earners, which will make inequality and poverty worse. I give way.
Fraser, briefly.
Way on the specific point. He was there, of course, and asked Mary Spowart from the Fraser Valley Institute that question. Her response to him was there was no evidence on this either way. Either way. So it's a fair debating point, presiding officer, but you cannot quote her evidence in support of his position.
Patrick Harvey.
There's certainly no evidence for Murdo Fraser's position, and all there is his ludicrous ideological attachment to the Laffer curve, which I think has been pretty much blown out of the water in the past. As for the Labour position, there's some overlap with our own arguments on the budget, and I welcome the fact that Labour are adopting something closer to the Green approach of offering positive ideas which we know the government can deliver. They are, of course, aware that we've also advocated free bus travel for young people as a step toward completely fare-free public transport in the longer term. And the final word of their amendment is planet, presumably a reference to the need which Greens have set out for a climate emergency budget. That does mean investing in public transport and in active travel, but it also must mean shifting away from the multi-billion-pound road-building programme which the Scottish Government is still committed to. And I'm put in mind of my first years as a member of this Parliament when I was first elected, arguing against all of the other parties in this chamber in opposition to the M74 extension, a relic of 1960s transport thinking. And it often feels, presiding officer, that we still haven't moved away from that kind of approach to transport. Even the Scottish Government's own Infrastructure Commission says there should be a presumption against new road capacity and in favour of maintaining and repurposing existing infrastructure. That would free up the spending that we need if we were to make serious commitments on getting our homes and buildings off the gas grid and hooked up to renewable and district heating systems. As for the government's position, there's an enjoyable demolition, I think, of the Conservative sums, but it then says that we recognise the Scottish Government will present a balanced budget that tackles climate change, well-being, etc., etc. Quite apart from my tediously predictable rejection of the contradiction in the phrase sustainable economic growth, we simply don't know yet whether this government will indeed present a budget that prioritises these objectives. That's because even in this extraordinary year, when the timescale is so constrained because of UK government choices, the Scottish Government continues to play its cards close to its chest instead of co-producing a budget with the opposition parties prior to its introduction. If they did so, the budget process would be incapable of descending into the brinkmanship that it has done in the past, and it would produce a result that's driven by the public interest. That kind of mature approach to these issues only feels unlikely here because this Parliament has often been so polarised. Many of our European neighbours are better at this, and we should take lessons from them.
Thank you very much, Mr Harvey. And I call Willie Rennie, please. Mr Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The budget tomorrow is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to move beyond the division. I think people in this country have had enough. We've seen years of division over Brexit, and if Patrick Harvey has his way, we'll repeat it all over again with independence. So forgive me for being concerned about the economic impact of independence, but it's something I don't believe in, and there's therefore nothing I can countenance. So therefore it is important that we look, therefore, for an opportunity to move beyond that division. And whatever our views on independence, and I believe that those in this chamber do support it wholeheartedly, it's clear that there will not be another independence referendum in the next financial year. It's pretty clear. The First Minister admitted that last year. So there should be no objection to having no line in the budget at all on independence. We should be able to move beyond it because we're not going to have that referendum. So that would remove, not just now, that would remove a massive boulder in the way between those who support independence and myself and others in terms of reaching agreement on the budget. So if it's that simple, let's remove it from the budget. I'll take an intervention.
Minister.
I was just wondering if Willie Rennie could confer to the Chamber how much money was in for independence in last year's budget.
Willie Rennie.
We know from the Permanent Secretary that there's been quite a significant sum of money that has been devoted towards independence. If we can have that guarantee that that will not be done, because there is not going to be an independence referendum this year, that creates a golden opportunity for people right across this chamber to work together. But even in that circumstance where the First Minister has set out that there will be no referendum, then still they refuse to take it out. So let's not accuse others of trying to put a block in the way of an agreement. The block has been created by the SNP government. But there is an opportunity to look at what we can do together. And we have got a constructive contribution that we would like to make to this budget process. We would like to actually make sure that local government is given the finance that it deserves, because we know that the Scottish Government have made significant commitments on their behalf. £500 million worth of commitments. They say it's partnership. I think the arm was tied behind the back of local government when those commitments were made. So it was no partnership. These were commitments made by the government that should be followed through by the government. And then you should have inflation, obviously, on top of that as well. So there's a significant commitment that will be required to local government just to meet the commitments, just to stand still just now. Obviously, we've got a big expansion of nursery education, which we support and should be properly funded as well. We've heard about the police and the state of our police estate, the state of our buildings, and of course, the state of our mental health of our police officers needs that support too. So we think support should go into the police as well. And then, of course, mental health, where an awful lot of people, young people, in fact, over 800 young people are waiting beyond a year to get mental health treatment when it's supposed to be a top priority of this government. And of course, we need to work together on the massive challenge of the climate emergency, which is why we're pleased to participate in that cross-party effort to try and find solutions to deal with the climate and make sure we live up to our obligations, our world-leading targets. So all of those things need support from this budget, and there is an opportunity for us to do that, because I think there's an awful lot of common ground on those issues, and I would hope the Scottish Government would live up to that. It's disappointing that the Conservatives refused to take responsibility for the rather chaotic way that we're having to agree the budget this year. The fact that we're going right up to the cliff edge when we would need to make decisions and local governments would need to set their budgets. A reckless act, and I hope it is not repeated again next year, because we cannot be forced into this rushed budget process. We need time to consider and deliberate on these important matters. And actually, if you did, I have to say, if you did have a federal structure in this United Kingdom where there was no effort by one part of the United Kingdom to commit detriment to another part of the United Kingdom, we might avoid these situations. So these things are important for the long-term stability of the United Kingdom. And I am confused, utterly confused by the Conservative position on tax now. They have not really set out. I mean, they still condemn, apparently, the tax bombshell, the rip-off, the highest tax part of the United Kingdom. If it was so important 2 years ago, if it's so important ever since, why is it not on the priority list for this year's budget? And I suspect I know the reason why. I know the reason why is because they are refusing to set out where the cuts to public services would come. They will not set that out because they know that price is too high. They know the detriment to the Scottish economy has not been what they claimed. We have not seen the brain drain that they were claiming would happen in Scotland. So they have been caught out. They now realise that it's a price that they cannot afford to pay, and therefore they're not prepared to spell it out in their budget proposals for this year. I'm sorry, Murdo Fraser, I'm sure we can have a discussion at a later stage. But I think we have found, just like yesterday where the Conservatives had a screeching U-turn on the uniform business rates, I think we've had another screeching U-turn from the Conservatives today. So I think I urge, in conclusion, I urge the Scottish Government to remove that boulder of independence so we can all work together to achieve a budget that's sustainable for Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Open debate, speeches of 6 minutes, tight 6 minutes, very little time for interventions. You must absorb these. Ruth Maguire, followed by Dean Lockhart.
Presiding Officer, today the Conservative Party are demanding millions in additional funding for public services. millions of pounds of investment whilst wanting to slash taxes for Scotland's highest earners. Both leadership candidates have outlined their plans which mirror Boris Johnson's tax regime at Westminster. Plans which IPPR Scotland argue would cost Scotland over £1 billion across 4 years. Plans which the think tank has described as unaffordable. A growing list of spending demands despite both candidates for the next Tory leader vowing to hand top earners tax cuts. Public services need investment, and it's fair that higher earners pay their fair share to fund our schools and hospitals. If the Tories want to promise top earners a handout, they have to explain what public service they'd cut to fund it. The Finance Secretary will set out the Scottish budget tomorrow, a balanced budget that prioritises well-being, tackles climate change, reduces child poverty and promotes sustainable economic growth. Our public services are vital to the people we serve, and there's an onus on every party in our Parliament to act responsibly on budget matters. It won't be a secret or a surprise that I oppose the Tory approach to taxation of public services, but it's healthy and right our Parliament has parties with different ideology and political positions. The communities that we serve all certainly do. Characterising these differences as division is at best unhelpful and at worst actually pretty irresponsible. I would say if the Tories want to cut tax for the rich, if they wish to promise high earners a handout, they must, if they wish to be taken seriously, be clear and honest about where they'll take the money for. The motion asks for a £15.4 million national... The motion asks for a £15.4 million national drug rehabilitation bed fund. We debated the national emergency of drug deaths last week, Presiding Officer, and I believe there was consensus on this, that no one government or organisation and no one single intervention can end this tragedy of preventable and avoidable death. And I do welcome the work of the Drugs Task Force and would reiterate my calls last week that the Scottish Government do all they can to ensure immediate action around the things that we do have power of. We have to make sure there's a range of services and interventions available to people and their families where and when they need them. That, of course, includes residential rehabilitation beds. But I'm a little concerned that this is being flagged as if it is the solution. Good as the intention of those proposing as such might be, I think it's a bit simplistic. I would, of course, no thank you. I would, of course, urge increased investment in services, in harm reduction, in treatment and recovery. But as important as that is, transparency and accountability around how money moves through health and social care systems, and responsibility for measuring and assessing outcomes is a whole other new debate. The Presiding Officer, the Tory motion also calls for an additional £10 million for the Ending Homelessness Together fund. And of course that fund is already allowing the Scottish Government to deliver the actions recommended by the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group. One person without a home is one too many. And again, additional investment in housing would be very, very welcome. But it has to be said that, of course, the Scottish Government would have not just £10 million, but £100 million, were they not having to spend that protecting people in Scotland from the worst effects of Tory austerity. And that same austerity, the years of Tory austerity, is actually putting people at risk of homelessness, squeezing more families into poverty and leaving them struggling to afford food and rent. Now, of course, we can't stand by and simply allow UK benefit cuts to hit the poorest in Scotland. We must mitigate what we can, but it's simply not feasible to completely mitigate all the impact of UK cuts. And surely we all aspire to more than just mitigating harm imposed on us from elsewhere. Spending to just stand still or spending to just prevent the worst harm, we can do better. The Scottish Government invested £1.4 billion supporting low-income households, and where we have the power, we've demonstrated that we can do better. Aspirations and action to do more than just mitigate harm. And when we are free of Westminster, this Parliament will be able to do even more. So today, as the Tories are demanding millions in additional funding for public service, millions of pounds of investment, whilst wanting to slash taxes for Scotland's highest earners, with the independent Fraser of Allender Institute making it clear that Tory tax proposals would reduce the government income tax revenues by around £270 million. Calling for spending increases, Presiding Officer, while demanding huge tax cuts does not add up. It's actually an approach that some of our constituents might feel is an attempt to mislead them, and I understand why they would feel like that. So I ask Conservatives, if they're really serious about public services in Scotland, to join us in calling for a reversal of the cuts to the Scottish budget and an end to the austerity agenda, which has heaped misery and suffering on so many of the people we're here to represent.
Thank you very much. Dean Lockhart, followed by Keith Brown. Mr Lockhart, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Tomorrow's budget will be one of the most important in recent years, not least because the Scottish Government will benefit from a significant increase in funding from the UK Government. The Resource Block Grant will increase in real terms by 2.1% this year, bringing additional funding of more than £1.1 billion to the Scottish budget. This is over and above the £1.2 billion being invested by the UK Government in city deals and the hundreds of millions of pounds of financial transactions money which will fund the Scottish National Investment Bank. All of this means the Scottish Government can use this additional funding to improve public services in Scotland. The Scottish Government will also be in a position to take direct action to reverse the ongoing decline in the Scottish economy. And despite all the denials from Derek Mackay, economic decline is exactly what we're seeing in Scotland. Just last week, the figures published by the Scottish Government itself, the size of Scotland's economy was written down by a remarkable 3%, with total GDP declining from 180 billion to 175 billion. And earlier today, Derek Mackay, here in the Chamber, confirmed that since the SNP came to power, total economic growth in Scotland has been 5% lower than the rest of the UK, meaning that the Scottish economy is now £7 billion smaller than it should be. All of this is what the Fraser-Vounder has described as the longest period of low growth in Scotland for 60 years and has resulted in Scotland having a record fiscal deficit of 7.2% of GDP, the highest in Europe. Now, it's going to take more than one budget to reverse this 13-year economic decline, but tomorrow's budget must make a start. First, by reducing the large business supplement, a tax which discourages firms looking to expand. Since it was doubled in 2016, more than 20,000 firms across Scotland have paid more than £250 million in this tax. That's £250 million which could have been invested by business in higher paid jobs, in new technology to improve productivity, or in expanding their business. But instead, that £250 million has been taken away from business and wasted by the SNP in a multitude of bad investments, which, according to Audit Scotland, last year alone resulted in investment losses of £140 million for the Scottish Government in 1 year alone. The other economic... Yes, I'll give way if the Minister wants to explain why the SNP has lost all that money, all that taxpayers' money.
Minister.
It's just a point of clarification. I assume the member is aware that the large business supplement is reinvested through small business bonus, which is another one of the Conservative asks in this budget process.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, the money that goes into the SNP's black hole, I'm not quite sure how that money is spent. And, Minister, the proof is in the pudding, because, as I said today, Derek Mackay confirmed that under this SNP government, the Scottish economy has grown 5% smaller than the rest of the UK. So those are the numbers that really count. The other economic priority for this budget must be to stop the increasing income tax burden in Scotland. There is nothing, the Minister calls it fair and progressive. There is absolutely nothing fair or progressive about the fact that everyone earning over £27,000 pays more income tax here than the rest of the UK. These people are not rich. According to the SNP in last year's budget, this higher tax policy was going to lead to higher funding for public services, something we now know is actually not true. According to the Fraser-Vounder, at the time the high tax policies were introduced, they were forecast to raise additional money. This has not come to pass. Higher tax in Scotland will be cancelled out by lower wage growth. So there we have it. Hard-working people in Scotland are paying more tax and taking less wage home, not to raise extra public spending, but to subsidise the economic failures of the SNP. This might be what the SNP calls fair and progressive. That's not an idea we share. Those taxes are punishing the hard-working people of Scotland. And with tax policies like these, it's not surprising under the SNP, Scotland has become a low-growth, low-wage and low-productivity economy. Now, Presiding Officer, I mentioned earlier that the Scottish Government is on track to receive record levels of funding from the UK Government, but this budget is a game of two halves. First, in the UK Government's half, we will indeed see an increase in the block resource grant of 2.1% in real terms. But in the SNP half of the budget, the decline in tax revenues relative to the rest of the UK means that we will see a downward adjustment of this block grant. Again, according to the Fraser-Valander, the positive outlook for the block grant will be offset by negative income tax reconciliations in Scotland, meaning that the block grant will grow by less than 1% in real terms. In other words, the failure of the SNP to grow the economy will mean that we will lose over £1 billion of funding in the next 2 years. I'm about to enter my last minute. We will lose £1 billion of funding in the next 2 years that should be available for public services in Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, the real story of this budget is that despite falling tax revenues in Scotland, despite a record fiscal deficit, and even after the downward adjustment in the block grant, the Scottish budget will still increase. And that's because the Boris bonus will bail out the £1 billion budget black hole created by the SNP. Now, I don't expect the SNP to thank the UK government for bailing them out, but they must recognise the reality of the fiscal position in Scotland. First, the economic failure of the SNP is costing billions of pounds that should be coming to public services. Second, despite this, and despite a record fiscal deficit, the Scottish budget will still increase. And that's because being part of the UK delivers a union dividend of £2,000 for every person in Scotland and a fiscal transfer of over £10 billion a year to fund public services. And, Presiding Officer, as we all know, all of this would disappear immediately in the event of independence. I support the motion in Murdo Fraser's name.
Thank you very much. I call Keith Brown to be followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Brown, please.
Presiding Officer, the motion in Murdo Fraser's name is incoherent, financially illiterate and intrinsically designed to bolster and increase the inequality for which the Tory UK is renowned. A flavour of the incompetence and incoherence of the Tory group was yesterday's farcical admission that they only supported the centralisation of rates, just to see how it played out at stage 3. The contempt for the small business sector and the rates relief that they depend on make the Tories the anti-business party. If you don't believe me, Boris told businesses where they could go, in words that I'm not allowed to repeat in this chamber. If you can give me a chance to get into my speech, I will come back to you, Mr Fraser. So Boris told businesses where they could go, in words that I can't repeat. Liam Fox slated businesses in this country as lazy, and every economist that you can talk to will tell you that Brexit has hit the economy and will hit businesses even harder in future. But of course, we have a deal with the EU, which if we don't manage to get it, and apparently it doesn't really matter, we can get a deal with like the same as Australia has with the EU, except for the fact, of course, Australia doesn't have a deal with the EU. Happy to take an intervention from Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Brown for taking the intervention. Can he tell us what impact will it have upon the town of Dollar that their constituency MSP voted yesterday to impose an additional tax burden on that town's largest employer, namely Dollar Academy?
Keith Brown. Well, I don't know whether Murdo Fraser has spoken to Dollar Academy, but I have spoken to Dollar Academy, and they're completely at ease with the decisions taken by the Scottish Government. And if he wants to check that out, of course he can one day come to Dollar, a beautiful town in my constituency where I live, and check that for himself. But Murdo Fraser's motion says it wants to help local government, even though every council in the land has told them not having a UK budget by this time is detrimental to local government, to the organisations it supports and to the communities that they serve. And we've heard a lot about taxes. Murdo Fraser doesn't want any more tax. And yet the Public Works Loans Board has just increased the cost to every single council in Scotland for borrowing. And it's done so because of extravagant decisions, as they see it, by councils in England. Not one word of protest from the Tory benches in this chamber about that Tory tax being applied to every single council in Scotland. And really, is that not their function? Are they not meant to be here to defend Scottish councils as well? Or just simply to do what Boris Johnson tells them to do? And talks about the block grant, as we've heard so much from Westminster, are frequent, but they don't really talk about how the block grant is arrived at. Yesterday, the UK Government took a decision on health spend that will determine what the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish governments will get to spend on health. Of course, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland representatives were specifically excluded from voting on it. Only after the big decisions are taken on spending do Scottish representatives get to decide. Presiding Officer, when they write the history of how Scotland regained its independence, some of the words they will use were the words uttered by the Speaker yesterday when she said, "I discern Scottish voices." A bit similar to "I spy strangers." There are foreigners in this chamber. They don't have the same rights as other people in the Westminster Parliament. And they do that because of the offensive outcome of a constitutional perversion called evil. So what else is spent in our name without our consent and then represented as a Scottish deficit before any Scottish bloc is agreed? Well, there are some suggestions as to how we can do, as Murdo Fraser asked us to do, reduce this fantastic fiscal transfer that we get. In fact, we could eliminate it altogether if you look at some of the proposals. Don't spend £200 billion on nuclear weapons. That would be a start. When you decide to have an airwave emergency system, don't go way over budget by £2 billion and years of delay. Don't double the national debt to £1.9 trillion. That's £1,900 million. You've increased the national debt, the party of fiscal rectitude. Double the national debt. Don't go £70 to £80 billion over cost on high-speed rail. Don't go £3 billion over cost on Crossrail. The list of failures of the Tory government, their financial incompetence, is legion. And I tell you, you've talked about a 3.4% increase for the health service. Let's look at the increase. Let's look at the increase in the budget of the Scotland office from 2011 to 2018. 555% increase in the comms budget of the Scotland office. And that's before you take into account the cost of RAF jets to shepherd ministers around the UK. So don't talk about budgets increasing, because the 3.4% for the NHS is below long-term average. Everyone knows that inflation in the NHS is greater than general inflation. And it's about inequality for the Tories. They maintain austerity. They told us before the election austerity was finished, and now they're all being told to make a 5% cut. And of course, the public sector pay cap remains, even for service personnel. They still have the public sector pay cap. And why do Tories never say the following words? Scotland has the lowest tax rate in the whole of the UK. The reason they don't say it is because it affects low-tax people, low-paid people, and they don't represent low-paid people. All their tax proposals are designed to help the better off. And if you don't believe me, they've quoted very often the Fraser Valander Institute. The Tories' policy, it says, the Tories' policy is framed as supporting middle earners, predominantly benefits households at the top of the distribution of household income. There you have it. The Tories are trying to save the high earners at the expense of the low earners. But really, the incompetence in the motion, the flagrant inability to account for the £270 million they want to take out to give to high earners is not accounted for. And this government, this parliament, this country deserves to have a main opposition party that at least has the ability to put forward a credible alternative to the budget. And this motion is not that.
Thank you very much. And I call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish Labour is clear. It is time for a budget that invests in the future and in future generations. We must all be clear. The climate emergency is the greatest threat facing humanity, and it is down to legislators to take drastic action that delivers a just transition for all. The upcoming budget process is vitally important in enabling the rapid and regenerative policy required to meet our targets. Plans must be set in motion, trajectories must be bold, and transformative funding is necessary to benefit the future of communities and of our planet. And fair funding to local government is a must if they are to be able to take the lead on so many of the emissions reductions areas. COSLA has asked for that role not to be undermined. Understanding the climate emergency is here, and public expectation has exponentially increased on this, and councils are determined to deliver. The funding gap means barriers to local action on climate change. A budget that invests in local government is the only way local communities will be justly kept in step with emissions reduction efforts. The people of Scotland, Scottish Labour is clear, want a council that enables them out of their cars and onto reliable public transport. Scottish Labour's budget ask, which we highlighted in last year's conference, for free bus travel for under 25s is a powerful step towards increasing bus usage and cutting transport emissions, reducing transport costs as a barrier to opportunity. The people of Scotland also want a council that can bolster energy efficiency, keeping everyone in a warm home and bringing new, skilled local jobs. They want a council that makes recycling an easy habit and keeps our local environment beautiful and accessible. Green spaces which hold value, positive for physical and mental well-being, for community cohesion, and for delivering nature-based solutions to climate change and job creation. In fact, all of these examples can be tied into strengthening local economies, delivering job creation and opportunities for manufacturing indeed. It is vital that Scotland has the skills to seize these opportunities, though. As we structure the economic and societal shift to net zero and our interim targets for 2030, just transition is not a process we should talk about without taking very great care. Care for our communities and care for working people and businesses across all sectors, as Rhoda Grant has stressed. There have been too many missed opportunities, not least in renewables manufacturing. One of the keys to unlocking the fair future in the context of the climate emergency is the strategic development of both initial and transferable skills. I and many others have long argued that there should be robust skills future strategies across all and across lifelong learning as well. Whether it is to ensure oil and gas workers have the opportunity to move into renewables industry without costly safety training courses and can do shortened courses, or whether it is for courses to support plumbers and roofers to install solar and air source heat pumps. It is fundamentally important, and Scottish Labour argues for a fair future for further and higher education, a fair funding in the Scottish Government budget. A focus on colleges is also vital, not least because colleges are the most common destination for those from deprived backgrounds. Funding allocation in the budget must reflect the importance of these institutions to society and help with the green jobs revolution and the widely changing jobs market. Further, Scottish Labour amendment also highlights that the Scottish Government budget needs to look forward, linking spending to national outcomes. For a number of years, I've been part of the Cabinet Secretary's Roundtable on the National Performance Framework, with its core values including treating all people with kindness, dignity and compassion. And as the national outcomes, including from actually being able to grow up loved and safe and respected, to having thriving and innovative businesses with quality jobs and fair work for all. These are absolutely imperative. It must surely be clear to all across the chamber that it is of fundamental importance to our future and will be analysed by committees in the budget process. However, it is disappointing that in spite of this important living framework, each budget seems to fail to link the national outcomes with spending in a way that can be understood. And the Auditor-General has made it clearly apparent that readers of the budget and documents, I quote, are unable to see the links between the money spent by the Scottish Government, what it has achieved and the progress made towards achieving national outcomes. Can the Minister address in her closing remarks how she will ensure that this budget is to be better aligned with the outcomes and with the national performance framework so that we can have a truly prosperous Scotland going forward into the future generations in the climate emergency for us all? Thank you.
Thank you. I call Liam Kerr to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Murdo Fraser opened this debate for the Conservatives today and was clear that there are two areas that we view as priorities for this budget: measures to grow the Scottish economy and, secondly, support for vital public services. Now, in relation to the second limb, it will come as no surprise to learn that my fingerprints are all over the demand for an additional £50 million for police to be spent on protecting 750 officer roles. As Murdo Fraser made clear, I would far rather go much further, but I have ensured, as I shall set out later, that this proposal is realistic and affordable. I say ideally it would go much further, and in short course it must. This distracted Scottish Government has to get some focus back on the police, but let me do it for them. Financially, Police Scotland is in a terrifying situation with an operating deficit for 2019-20 of £25 million. This is in a context of a funding shortfall of £56 million to the police capital budget compared to what they were expecting in November 2018. Now, what is the practical impact of that? Well, it means planned investment in things like vehicles, the estate and IT has been slashed. It means that, according to the Scottish Police Federation, many vehicles are held together with duct tape. The Scottish Government may not be aware that half the fleet currently operates well beyond replacement criteria. It means that the Chief Constable has to describe IT capability as poor, due to underinvestment and lack of funding that has led to lack of a national network. He said, younger officers coming in now are taken aback by how backward a lot of our approach is. They live in a digital, mobile world, and they come to work and they almost have to step back into an analogue world. And it is no news to anyone that police stations are in a desperate state. I say anyone, but when the First Minister was challenged about revelations of mould, leaks and rat infestations in police buildings across the country, she claimed critics had a nerve to raise the matter and claimed the SNP's funding of the force was perfectly adequate. The Cabinet Secretary described the warnings as hyperbole, shortly before the dining room ceiling in Broughty Ferry Police Station collapsed, leading to the station being evacuated and abandoned. However, it is the issue of officer numbers which this minister can fix at the stroke of a pen. Nearly every area of Scotland has fewer divisional officers on the front line since the merger. These are the core local resource who patrol the streets and respond to calls. It is important to note that of those, 300 are paid for by external bodies, such as our similarly underfunded local councils, and 400 by the UK government. I am sure that the minister would accept that none of us can countenance any further reductions in officer numbers. Indeed, perhaps most significantly, the Federation have stated, and I quote, "Community policing is at risk." And, presiding officer, you'll have seen today's Scotsman. Crime in Scotland could soar if the systemic underfunding of the National Constabulary is allowed to continue, says the Chief Constable. The Federation say that balancing the budget requires a 750 reduction in officer numbers. And Audit Scotland warned just last month that unless an increase in funding of £50 million was made available, up to 750 frontline officers could lose their jobs. Yes, presiding officer, if an extra £50 million is not provided to Police Scotland in this budget, our police force faces cuts, presiding officer, of 750 officers. As the Chief Constable said only yesterday, without it, he faces the very real prospect of simply not having the money to investigate crimes. And let's not forget that violent crime is rising under this SNP government. This is the reason for my budget demand. We ask our police to put their lives on the line for us, day in, day out. This government has demanded that they work in crumbling buildings, drive cars held together with duct tape, use prehistoric IT systems, and multitask to cover a huge number of services that we wouldn't think of as policing. This government cannot surely be prepared to accept a situation in which they have to do all that, but with 750 fewer officers. It seems, however, that they do. The Minister's amendment makes no mention of police, yet specifies what else she thinks should be priority. She didn't mention the police once in her 8-minute speech, but she did talk about money. And officers will not be persuaded if there is any attempt to suggest there is no money, because as today's motion makes clear, the block grant will grow by at least £1.1 billion in real terms, a 2.1% real terms increase, all thanks to the unprecedented investment by the Conservative UK government and a Barnett formula that pools and shares resources around our United Kingdom, a Boris bonus indeed. Now, in 2008, former Scottish Conservative leader Annabel Goldie forced the SNP government to increase police numbers by 1,000. Just imagine the situation we'd be in if she hadn't. We will continue to follow this example and continue to argue for the respect and resources our police officers need. The Scottish Conservatives are committed to supporting our police and are committed to providing the extra £50 million they need to ensure these 750 police officers continue to keep our communities safe, continue to catch criminals and police our streets. The Minister must do likewise. The Minister must be aware that failure to deliver this will represent a failure to support our police, to protect those communities and to effectively govern Scotland. Our police officers are watching. The people of Scotland are watching. Is she going to put the needs of the Scottish people first with a modest investment in our police, or will she continue to prioritise her own narrow political agenda?
Thank you very much. I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Officer, and I welcome that the Tories have submitted a wish list, but their motion and what I've heard so far in the Chamber amidst robust and realistic costings. And after listening to Liam Kerr, I'm astonished that none of the Conservatives made any comment over the last decade when their colleagues down south were cutting 20,000 police officers. So it just tells you what would have happened if they had actually been in power here in Scotland. The alleged 2.1% real terms increase, which has so thrilled Murdo Fraser these last weeks, appears actually to be spread very thinly. And indeed, today he answered that it was in reality only 1% in real terms. So why do the Tories never fully cost their proposals? It's the most basic of tasks, yet they just don't seem willing or able to be serious about it. In relation to tax cuts for high earners, we already know that these would cost £270 million, and the Fraser Allender Institute has identified that those earning over £100,000 would benefit most. So it's good that Murdo Fraser appears to have abandoned this proposal. If we adopted the same policy as the UK Tory government, increase a higher rate to £50,000 plus earners, this would mean service cuts of a whopping £1 billion over 4 years. How would the Scottish Government pick up such a tab when we have more in-work poverty and food bank usage thanks to Tory welfare cuts than any time in recent history? And where would this money be taken from? Do the Tories want us to stop spending £100 million a year mitigating the effects of their own UK Government welfare cuts? Incidentally, figures published by National Records Scotland show no signs of that Tory-predicted high-earner exodus to England since the devolution of income tax, another scare tactic which has failed to actually have any impact. As for non-domestic rates, well, I think it was daft to support the Greens' Amendment 9 to begin with. I commend both Labour and the Tories for belatedly voting to keep the powers and responsibilities to set non-domestic rates where they currently lie. Ultimately, this is about shops to nurseries and others who benefit from these reliefs. The Tories know that Scotland has the most substantive package of rates relief across the UK, but if they wish to make it more generous, will they tell us what public services should be cut in order to finance them? The UK Government's delay in announcing its budget makes it difficult for the SNP Government to allocate its resources as accurately as it must. The Finance Secretary will tomorrow provide a degree of certainty for local government and vital public services, but it will remain extremely challenging for local authorities to set budgets, not knowing exactly how much will be allocated to them. As a member of the Local Government and Communities Committee, I share the desire for well-funded council services, so I was glad last year when the SNP Government delivered a funding package of £11.2 billion for local authorities, a real terms increase of more than £310 million, despite having its own budget cut by the UK Tory Government once again. The irony of Conservatives playing knight in shining armour for council budgets in Scotland is not lost on this side of the chamber, given the huge cuts the Tories have imposed on England. Last November, the TUC in Unison published an extensive analysis revealing that overall councils in England have had £7.8 billion a year less to spend on key services than they did when the Tories and Lib Dems came to power in 2010, equalling a cut of £150 million a week. Also showed that, coincidentally, the 20 councils with the biggest funding gaps are overwhelmingly metropolitan boroughs in London and the north of England, with 18 under Labour control. Meanwhile, 16 of the 20 councils that suffered the smallest cuts were Tory-led. Fortunately, the SNP has more regard for a fair allocation and distribution of funding to local authorities. I welcome that in their amendment, Labour, and I quote, acknowledges the human impact over a decade of austerity has had on communities, jobs, public services and the economy. Given that Labour was in power at Westminster until the summer of 2010, I'm pleased by Labour's mea culpa in finally acknowledging responsibility for kick-starting austerity, a policy their bosses in London supported well into 2015. A majority of MSPs and, in the last 3 opinion polls, support independence, yet Willie Rennie thinks the majority in this chamber should wield to his wee rump group of 5 MSPs, Liberal Democrats indeed. The Greens, their demand that we stop building a new road capacity, for example, such as the A9, is not one that I agree with. The A9 is being dual to enhance connectivity, improve safety and reduce the congestion that increases both pollution and driver stress. It is not a new road, and buses will also travel on the A9. And surely any abandonment of such projects would not only throw hundreds, if not thousands of construction workers on the dole, but mean a hefty penalty for breach of contract imposed on the Scottish Government while leaving part of the route looking like a building site. Siren calls to cancel a key infrastructure project should therefore not be heeded. And from an Ayrshire and Renfrewshire perspective, I'm really keen that the A737 is upgraded too, helping improve safety and reduce the congestion endured by many of my own constituents, and indeed local Conservative, Labour and independent politicians also support that position. In any case, billions more is raised in fuel taxes, albeit that such revenues accrue to the UK Treasury than are spent on roads, allowing for investment in public transport, cycling and walking. Presiding Officer, despite the delay to the UK budget, the SNP government will confirm individual local authority funding allocations. We already know that flexibility remains for local authorities to raise more revenue by increasing council tax levels by up to 3% in real terms. Tomorrow, the SNP government will put forward a budget that focuses on well-being, tackles climate change, reduces child poverty and promotes sustainable economic growth. It will be well considered, fair and progressive. I hope that not just the Tories but all parties will contribute in a constructive manner and provide full costings for any amendments they may have.
Thank you very much. I call Polly McNeill to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
It was Naomi Eisenstadt, the government's advisor in poverty, who said that the age group that needed most policy attention is the age group aged 19 to 24. Those young people who have left school trying to form their plans for the future. And for those not going into higher or further education, they get very little return for the state. So I believe it's time to focus policy on how we can help young people in that age group. And I would only be delighted to work with the Green Party on this policy, or any other party who wants to join us in the proposal that we have in the amendment. That's why I believe that Labour's budget asks for free bus travel for under 25s is the right thing to do for the times that we live in, and that we would propose to do that in the £1.1 billion Barnett consequentials. I believe this would revolutionise the lives of young people, and for those from less well-off families, and in particular the 16 to 19 age group. I think it's quite a serious anti-poverty measure as well as being a climate change measure. It would help families with teenagers who are at school or college going to work. I did attempt to bring a bill to this Parliament to extend half fares for those up to age 18 for the same reasons that I think that young people haven't got the best deal out of this parliamentary term. It is a costly policy, but I believe is one that is justified, and we are wholeheartedly committed to it. A great deal of damage has been done to the lives of people in the last 10 to 12 years. And I say to Kenny Gibson, it's a matter of historical fact that it was the virtual criminality of the banking sector, or some in the banking sector, that actually brought the country virtually to its knees. No one is blameless. No one is blameless in this. But I think it is childish to say that it was a Labour government that was responsible for the subprime mortgage scam that went on, at which people's mortgages and savings were put under risk for that. I'll take a small intervention, but please, Mr Gibson, stick to the facts.
Was it 7 years after this banking crisis, Labour MPs in the House of Commons voted for a £30 billion cut, including £3 billion to Scotland's budget? That was 7 years after the crisis that you actually talk about, which is why they lost 40 of their 41 MPs in Scotland weeks later.
Thank you, that's enough. I find it quite interesting that in your analysis you don't mention the role of George Osborne, the Chancellor, who actually was the person who imposed the biggest austerity in this country has ever seen. But I'm sure, I hope we do agree, that 10 to 12 years has caused damage to people in their lives. And that's why I think it's really important that this budget is one in which we take people with us. We cannot leave people behind us, Rhoda Grant says, and I want to come on to this really important issue, because household incomes shrunk during that period. Energy prices are still rising. The cost of living has increased. Food banks were not a feature back then, they are now. And Scotland has the highest rate of homeless deaths in Britain by a long way. I mean, Scotland has the highest level of homeless deaths by a long way, according to Crisis, and 53% of them are drug-related. So no one is blameless, no party is blameless. And when we look at how people's lives have been damaged in the last 10 years, billions taken out of the welfare budget, creating real poverty. And in fact, universal credit, which should definitely come to an end, and I think we agree on that too, might have actually had a chance of working if £12 billion had not been taken out of it. But that's why this Parliament must use the powers that it has to improve the lives of Scots. And it's becoming crystal clear, if it wasn't before, to ordinary people, that years of underfunding local authorities is reaching crisis point. And actually is a point where actually ordinary people are beginning to notice it, where maybe they didn't notice it, we were trying to tell them 5 or 6 years ago. I would say to Cabinet Secretary that it is important when local authorities use their powers, whether it's to increase council tax or so, it's really important to explain to people why their taxes are increasing and what local authorities will do with those taxes. In Glasgow, the city I represent, only a few weeks ago, charities were concerned that they were being ruled out of applying for their funding on a technicality, and there was a bit of a cynical view that this was maybe done deliberately. That has thankfully been resolved to the pressure put on this Parliament. Local government revenue settlement has decreased at a much faster rate than the Scottish Government revenue budget, and Spice figures show that's by 7%, where the Scottish budget has been reduced by 2%. Every local authority service is under noticeable pressure. And last week, the Evening Times reported that in the Evening Times that Glasgow may have to sell off the Gallery of Modern Art, just as a start to begin to pay for the service that it is trying to uphold. Councils are increasingly drawing on their reserves. 45 million, 23 councils already doing it, so it's of serious concern. In my last minute, Presiding Officer, I just want to address the question that I put to Michael Matheson, Cabinet Secretary, on the vision for transport. It is of concern to me that we, and Claudia Beamish should address this point too, it's vital in this budget we take poor people and the less well-off people in the changes that we make in the climate change emergency. I'm astonished to learn that the government think that a loan repayable over 6 years is the answer to those who can't afford electric vehicles, when only this morning Good Morning Scotland reported that electric vehicles are still at a very early stage and that the battery requires replacing after 3 years. I plead with the government to think in more detail and more carefully about the policies that are going to be needed to make sure that every single person is included and not left behind in a budget which is about making people's lives better, and a budget that tackles the climate change emergency.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I think it's quite fitting to have this debate on the eve of the budget announcement tomorrow by the Finance Secretary. So I do welcome the fact that the Tories have actually brought it to the Chamber this afternoon. I also welcome the Tories showing their inability to count yet again, with their demands far outstripping any possible additional finance coming to this Parliament. Their £1.5 billion of demands versus the £1.1 billion of resource. Now, the Tories yet again today...
Fraser.
I wonder if Mr McMillan could do what the Finance Minister failed to do and explain how he arrives at the figure of £1.5 billion for measures which cost at a maximum £777 million.
Stuart McMillan.
I think Murdo Fraser needs to do his own research. Right. The Tories yet again today have shown their inability to actually understand the devolved situation that this Parliament actually operates under. But that isn't a surprise, Presiding Officer, because, well, as we know, the Tories didn't want this Parliament in the first place. Now, I wasn't surprised by the Lib Dems amendment, which wasn't taken. I mean, clearly, once again, the Lib Dems have proven they are obsessed with the Constitution. At every turn, they attempt to make every debate in this chamber a constitutional debate with a reference to federalism. Now, when one of them actually speaks later on, maybe they can provide a coherent explanation as to what their view of federalism actually is. After about 100 years, I thought actually they would have managed to provide some type of proposal by now. But their amendment started out so well, highlighting the farcical situation that this Parliament faces annually, and particularly this year. Presiding Officer, returning to the Tories, once again, their true colours have shown through today. Yesterday, they fought and failed on the issue of the independent school sector. And today, they argue for a tax cut for the rich, which would remove £270 million from the budget, according to the Fraser of Allender Institute. Now, the Tories are clearly focusing their attention to a reducing number of supporters and voters, and that's quite entirely up to them. Losing 7 seats at the recent election, losing 3.5% of their vote, and also 65,000 votes. That tells a story. Cutting the tax take will actually make it harder for many communities. And I can assure the Chamber that I don't have that many people in my constituency coming to me or contacting my office who are earning over £100,000 per annum. I do have many people who actually are earning a lot less and at the lower end of the scale. Now, I represent Greenock and Inverclyde, and I'm proud to represent my home. Now, we have always had our challenges, and we really haven't fully recovered as a community since the reduction in the shipbuilding and heavy engineering industries since the early 1980s. And it's something I've spoken about in this chamber before. We've lost over 30,000 people who have got on their bike because they had to get on their bike. And even with the following measures that the Scottish Government have introduced in recent years, there are still challenges to my community. Over 1,300 new social homes have been built since 2007. It's over £40 million that's come into my constituency. Over £10 million in building and refurbishing schools since 2007. Nearly £5 million in the People Equity Fund over the last 2 years. Over £770,000 in the Welfare Fund for this year. And over £20 million for the new Greenock Health Centre. And over £7 million for the new Continuing Care Hospital in Greenock. In addition, the Scottish Government have invested £12 million in helping bring diodes to Greenock, saving 300 jobs, and also taking over Ferguson's in Port Glasgow, saving over 300 jobs. If the tax cut for the rich that the Tories want, if that were to go ahead, then my community and others would be under even more economic challenges. Now, Murdo Fraser jokingly spoke of the Boris bonus, but this may for some people, this is actually just about money coming back to this Parliament because of the austerity, the deep austerity measures and cuts that the Tory party have inflicted upon Scotland and the rest of the UK. Sure.
Arthur.
Would the member agree with me that the real Boris bonus has been the bounce in the opinion polls for independence?
Stuart McMillan.
I couldn't agree more, Mr Arthur. But we also know that according to Boris, and I'm quite happy if any Tory wants to actually stand up and defend Boris in this, we also know that Holyrood doesn't matter one jot to Boris Johnson. Now, today the Tories are lauding Boris Johnson, but I wonder if they will laud him for his thoughts on this Parliament as well. Now, I welcome the fact that 55% of the Scottish taxpayers pay less income tax than they would if they lived elsewhere in the UK. I welcome the fact that the health budget is over £14 billion this year. I welcome the fact that local authorities received £11.2 billion, a real terms increase of £310 million this year. I also welcome the fact that car parking charges at NHS car parks were abolished. But sadly, our government can't abolish the PFI contracts agreed to by the Labour Liberal administration before. And I'm sorry, time's short. Presiding officer, Rhoda Grant mentioned food banks earlier. Last year, over 8,000 three-day food parcels were issued in Inverclyde. Many of these were as a result of the UK austerity agenda and welfare reform by the Tories. So whilst the Tories defend the rich and the wealthy by wanting the tax cut for their pals, I support the income tax proposals thus far helping my constituents. And today was more of the same from the Tories, and I look forward to the budget being delivered tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I call Graham Simpson to be followed by John Mason. Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the chance to take part in this debate a day before Derek Mackay unveils his latest spending proposals to a waiting world. Can I first of all, Presiding Officer, apologise to the Chamber for the length of the Conservative motion? I could read it out and sit down and that would be my speech. But the reason for it is because we've got so many good ideas. And I'm going to focus my remarks on housing and local government. Before I get into all that, Presiding Officer, I was interested to read at the weekend that Mr Mackay and Miss Forbes may have ended their friendship with Patrick Harvey and could be cooking up something with Labour and the Lib Dems. And they would certainly be right to shun Mr Harvey's advances this year. Well, maybe we've got a murmur of approval there from Mr Rennie. They would be right to shun Mr Harvey because the economy under Mr Mackay's stewardship is in enough trouble without the Greens' help. Now, we've engaged constructively with the budget process. Murdo Fraser, collegiate player that he is, asked us for ideas to share with Mr Mackay, and they're listed in the motion, all of them. And I hope the Minister will see fit to support some, if not all of them. Well, we'll see tomorrow. My own, extra money to councils to fight homelessness, came about because I was hearing that their plans in this area are not quite covered by, I have to say, the generous amount given so far by the Scottish Government. We reckon another £10 million. Yep.
Mr. Kate Forbes.
Doesn't have the figure to hand, but I wondered if you could tell me how much in terms of the costing. The motion refers to an increase in core funding for local government, at least in line with inflation. And on that specific cost, what is the figure that the Tories are using?
Graham Simpson.
Well, I was speaking about the extra money we were looking for homelessness, and I spoke to various stakeholders about that to come up with that figure. So it is based on some evidence. So we asked for another £10 million for the expansion of the Ending Homelessness Together Fund, specifically to allow additional resourcing of councils for their rapid rehousing transition plans. We think that would do the job. And figures on homelessness last week show why this is needed. As at 30th of September 2019, there were 11,432 households in temporary accommodation. That's an increase of 477 households compared to the previous year. And that's the highest figure since the provisions of the Housing Scotland Act 2001 were commenced in 2002. There were 3,500 households in temporary accommodation which had children or a pregnant member, and that's an increase of 8% over 2018. Now, money doesn't solve everything, but when it comes to tackling homelessness, it is vital. As well as funding the fight against homelessness, there's more that the Minister could consider. The target of completing 50,000 affordable homes in this parliamentary session was commendable, it is commendable, but without a guarantee that the programme will continue beyond next year, we are starting to see building stall. And we have serious concerns about the future supply of affordable housing. As yet, local authorities and housing associations have no guarantee of grant funding beyond March 2021. There's a risk that affordable developments will grind to a halt and the progress made to date will be lost. So that would be a shame. Through continuing to invest in affordable housing, the sector can stimulate the economy. The Fraser of Allender Institute's assessment of the economic contribution of Glasgow Housing Association found that through their investment programme, GHA had contributed approximately £2 billion to the GDP of Scotland since 2003 and supported on average 2,425 jobs a year. And investing in housing can help reduce child poverty, as evidenced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's Poverty in Scotland report. It can, of course, reduce homelessness. Lack of affordable housing was highlighted by Crisis as one of the main challenges in preventing and alleviating homelessness. The Minister could also look beyond producing new homes and look at existing stock. She'll be aware of the work of the Tenement Maintenance Working Group. Investing in existing stock can help to meet climate change targets. That should please Mr Harvey. But the annual public investment made by Scottish Government into fuel poverty and energy efficiency initiatives has remained at approximately 119 million since 2016. Now, analysis carried out by the existing Homes Alliance shows that investment must be increased to at least 240 million a year to meet climate change targets. Now, of course, to do all this, the Cabinet Secretary and Finance Minister have to change their approach to local government and properly fund councils. All the parties they're reaching out to at the moment are saying that. So let's hope tomorrow they deliver and that we can get a budget that we can all support.
Thank you very much. And I call John Mason to be followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I have to say I always enjoy speaking in a Tory debate. When I read the... there's so much fun. When I read the Conservative motion, I really wondered if the writer did understand basic arithmetic or maths. A whole list of extra funding demands, but with no additional taxation. They seem very definite about what Westminster will give us, despite the fact the Westminster budget is not due for over a month. yet they seem to be spending that money several times over. Now, I do accept that the opposition may see its role as demanding lots more money for lots of different sectors, with little thought as to where that money will come from. I suppose I had expected a little better from the Conservatives, but clearly I was over-optimistic in thinking that they would come up with a fully funded list of demands. I might give way later, we'll see. The Fraser-Vallender Institute, in their autumn budget report, also warned us to expect negative tax reconciliations of perhaps £200 million in 2021 and £600 million in 21-22, and these have not been mentioned in the motion, although I accept that Murdo Fraser did refer to them. Now, I think it's worth noting at this point that the UK Treasury interpretation of the 17-18 reconciliation is described as, quote, somewhat disingenuous, unquote, by the Fraser-Vallender Institute. I understand the UK Statistics Authority upheld a complaint from Derek Mackay that the UK government's interpretation of the reconciliation was, quote, incorrect, unquote. There does seem to be a fundamental weakness in the fiscal framework that we have to match the UK economic growth or we lose out. Of course, absolutely, we should aim to match or better UK growth, and in fact we do match Wales, Northern Ireland and most of the English regions. However, there does remain a problem with London, and whether you call it the driver of the UK economy or you call it a black hole which sucks resources out of the rest of the UK, either way it is extremely difficult to compete with it. It would also in this respect be helpful to know what is going to be in the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. We have now left the EU and still we have no details about that. On local government finance, we debated this fairly recently, and one of the themes of that debate was that more money for local government effectively means less money for the NHS, or vice versa, more for the NHS means less for local government. So I struggle to see how we could possibly have all the Barnett consequentials, which the Tories are asking for, going to health, and increase local government core funding at the same time, when we also have commitments such as increasing childcare, which I thought the Conservatives supported, but which cost money too.
Lockhart.
John Mason for giving way. It's interesting that none of the SNP speakers today have mentioned growing the economy as an option for increasing funding to public services. Is that because the SNP are simply not capable of growing the economy?
John Mason.
Well, I think one of my main points, which I was going to intervene before and somebody wouldn't take me, was that how can we possibly grow the economy when we've got a shortage of the workforce? If we cannot bring people in from other countries because we do not have enough young people ourselves, how can we possibly grow the economy? It doesn't matter how we do it if we don't have enough people. Now, I do find the Tory motion fascinating, both for some of the things that are in it and some which are not. They are against widening the tax gap, and they want non-domestic rates the same as in England, and they want spending on health as in England, with no suggestion that preventative spending, perhaps in other sectors, might take pressure off the health service itself. This seems to demonstrate a fear on the part of the Tories of being different from England in any way. Yet the very point of devolution is that we can and should do things differently in Scotland, even while staying for the time being in the UK. I have to say it's a pretty sad level of ambition that presumably, if hypothetically England was not there for us to compare ourselves with, the Conservatives would have no policies whatsoever. If they want to have lower non-domestic rates, then they are certainly entitled to argue for that, but it would be more convincing if they gave a reason for a particular level of NDR and also told us what public spending cuts there would be to compensate. If the Conservatives want everything to be the same as England, maybe it would be more honest for them to say that they actually do not want a Scottish Parliament at all. And some of the things that the Conservative motion does not mention, no mention of poverty, no mention of the gap between the income and wealth between the richest and the poorest, no mention of the environment, and a passing reference to drugs and homelessness, which do sound to me a bit like window dressing. The Tory motion also refers to NRAC, which is the NHS Scottish Resource Allocation Committee. I don't think I have time, I'm sorry. I'm certainly in favour of a fair funding formula across Scotland, and we should be, and I understand, are moving towards that. Obviously, the islands and remote areas have particular challenges. But funding according to need must be paramount. As I understand it, only 6% of Grampian's population are in the poorest 20% of the population, whereas 34% of Greater Glasgow and Clyde are in the poorest 20%. So the question remains whether that formula is giving adequate weight to poverty and deprivation. The deep-end GP practices represent about 100 of the GP practices in the poorest areas of the country. That's about 10%. And they would argue that there is not a sufficient share of GP funding going to areas of the greatest deprivation. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I very much look forward to tomorrow's budget. I'm sure there will be some imaginative and progressive measures, but we have to remember we are unable to affect corporation tax or the basic structure of income tax or national insurance, and we cannot make VAT more progressive. So while devolution gives a certain amount of latitude, we are still setting a budget with one arm tied behind our backs, and only real freedom for this country will let us achieve our ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll call Tom Arthur before we move to closing speeches. Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, which has turned into the annual pre-budget warm-up match. I think compared to some of the debates we've had last year, it's been more constructive. There's been more of an exchange of ideas. There seems to be a willingness from the Conservatives and indeed from the Labour Party, and latterly in the remarks from Willie Rennie to engage constructively. And I would echo Patrick Harvey in welcoming this approach. I think in terms of the public spending calls made within the Conservative motion, there's very little to disagree with. I think the question I would raise is the affordability of it. Murdo Fraser indicated he, like Neville Chamberlain, waved a piece of paper in the air when Mr Mackay challenged him. So I hope he will publish that, put it on record, and allow the Government and members to scrutinise these proposals, as indeed I'm sure the Government will set out their calculations of the Conservative spending proposals. I think there's a couple of things I want to pick up on the Conservative contribution. One was around income tax receipts, or the aspiration that income tax receipts should measure the rest of the UK. I think this concept of our UK is quite problematic, and that's because of the fundamental imbalance of the rest of the UK. If we think of one of the key drivers behind income tax receipts, earnings. Now, the latest statistics from April last year suggest that a typical gross salary in Scotland, annual gross salary, is £24,486, while for the UK it's £24,897. A marginal difference, but if we look at how the rest of the UK is actually structured, in the South East that goes up to £26,199, but for London it's £33,750. So there's that huge imbalance. So when we speak about the rest of the UK, we are speaking about an economy which has more variance in earnings and in productivity than the whole of the European Union. Indeed, there are parts of England where productivity is at a lower level than some of the poorest states in the United States. So it's a highly imbalanced economy, and our UK figure is to some extent artificially inflated by the performance of the London economy, and that has significant implications for the operation of the fiscal framework. Clearly, when we look at... certainly.
Dean Lockhart. I actually agree with Tom Arthur that London does indeed generate great wealth for the UK. But last time I looked, London wasn't going to join an independent Scotland, or does he know something different?
Tom Arthur.
Sorry, I missed the last part of the member's comment. Could you repeat it, please?
Dean Lockhart.
The point was that London does generate huge wealth for the UK budget as a whole, including the Scottish budget, but London will never in any situation be joining an independent Scotland, so an independent Scotland would lose the wealth generated by London.
Right. Tom Arthur.
That raises another interesting point, and that is a line of thinking that's common amongst unionist politicians. I think it was something she's not in the chamber, Joanne Lamont, when she was leader of the Labour Party, made reference to. She referred to the city-state of London as an engine for generating income for redistribution. But one of the concerns I have is if you have that model where you have your engine room located in one part of the country, then that attracts jobs, skills, inward investment, which makes it less desirable for people to live in other parts of the country. It creates a challenge around, for example, outward migration, a challenge we have in Scotland. So I don't actually think, moving on to I suppose the core Tory argument for the union now, which is what we describe as a union dividend, is that effectively we should accept an underperforming Scottish economy propped up by subventions from London. That's effectively the model. It's not the model I want for Scotland. I appreciate if that's the level of their ambition for Scotland, but it's not the level of ambition I have for Scotland. I think the challenge that we have to do is to go and match these advanced small economies. Now, certainly there are measures we can seek to do within the current devolved framework. For example, the proposal made by the Scottish Government around a Scottish visa, which would exist within the current constitutional arrangements, but would seek to create an opportunity to increase the number of inward migrants to Scotland. That was a constructive proposal brought forward. It had widespread support across Civic Scotland amongst the business community. There was an openness and willingness to engage, but it was dismissed by the UK Government within a matter of hours without seriously considering it. So that raises a real issue about how we can grow our economy in Scotland, because we know one of the big challenges that we have is if we look at, for example, GDP comparison between our UK and Scotland. Yes, there's a difference. The UK performs better, but if we start to look at it per capita, that difference decreases. And if we look at it per capita per working age population, then it starts to decrease further. And that is because we do have a demographic challenge in Scotland. Now, I'm not saying it is the only challenge we have in Scotland, but it is a key challenge, and it is one we have to address. And if the Conservatives really want to make the union work for Scotland, then they have to be more open and willing to admit that and to engage with the Scottish Government constructively when they put forward detailed sets of proposals about how we address some of these challenges, such as an ageing population. The final point I want to make, and what I was disappointed in terms of, I suppose my central disappointment in the contribution from Scottish Conservative members, and please forgive me if I misheard anyone, but I did not hear one reference to climate change. I did not hear one reference to social security in any of the contributions. So I hope that's something that the Conservative front bench will address in summing up, because climate change is the biggest challenge we face, and I commend the Scottish Government in putting that front and centre in its budget tomorrow. Thank you.
We now move to the closing contributions, and it's disappointing to note that not everyone who took part in the debate is back in the chamber. I call James Kelly for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's always interesting to take part in the annual pre-budget debate, and this time it comes the day before the budget's published. So for some of the MSPs, I think it's a bit like the night before Christmas, you know, getting a bit giddy and excited in their contributions as we await to see whether Derek Mackay appears as Santa Claus or Mr. Scrooge the following day. So tomorrow all will be revealed. First of all, just like to make a point on the process. Willie Rennie described it as chaotic, you know, and I think the UK Government publishing their budget on the 11th of March, you know, so late in this financial year, shows a kind of scant disregard, not just for the other devolved administrations, but also for local councils who are right up against the wire, not knowing what their settlement is. Patrick Harvey also underlined the fact that the Scottish Government could do more, particularly in the new budget process that we've got, in sharing information during the course of the year on different scenarios. So I think the process has been far from satisfactory. A number of people in the debate spoke about fair funding for local councils, and I thought Rhoda Grant described the problem very well, because in recent years we've seen a 7% reduction in revenue funding from 2013-14 for local councils under the SNP. Also at the same time seeing 40,000 less jobs since 2007. But against that, the SNP government are asking local councils to do more. There are additional £497 million of additional commitments. So the whole climate is very challenging for local councils, and it's against that backdrop that the demands for fair funding are very reasonable indeed. I thought Pauline McNeill set out the case for bus travel for under 25s very well, not only in the legitimacy of it, but also in the fact that it ticked various policy boxes. It helped tackle poverty for low-income households. It also helped with the climate change targets. and also it would help get young people to work and to college and to university, which is vital in terms of making an overall contribution to the economy. I think also in that regard, the budget should give a fairer settlement to colleges and universities. For example, in recent years there's been cuts to research and teaching grants at universities, and I think it should be remembered that these grants fund projects that look at innovation, which link into industry and the economy, and cuts in that area are undermining that economic growth. A number of speakers spoke about the importance of climate change. I thought that Claudia Beamish very much put her finger on one of the key issues in terms of the linking of spending to outcomes. And this is something that's been spoken of in a number of budget debates in recent years. And it's all very well committing to action on climate change, but we've got to see the outcomes on that. The Tories, Murdo Fraser and a number of Tory speakers spoke about a Boris bounce, but in reality it's really a Boris brass neck, because you saw yesterday the priorities of Tory MSPs when the Parliament debated the very reasonable proposal to cancel relief to private schools. You saw speaker after speaker from the Tory benches rise to their feet. Somebody said to me, it looks as if there's a number of selection meetings coming up with the Tory associations, so they were perhaps playing to the galleries. But it strikes me that when you've got the issue of thousands of people in Scotland in different communities relying on feed banks, you don't see Tory MSPs rising to complain about that. When you've got the reality of hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland not being paid the living wage, and some having to do 3 jobs in order to make ends meet and to support their families, you never hear complaints about that from the Tory benches. And last week, when we saw I won't take an intervention, I'm running out of time. When we saw the publication of the multiple deprivation index, the areas of poverty in Scotland, if you took a Tory MSP to some of these areas like Springhall and Rutherglen and Whitlaburn and Cambuslang, they would be strangers out of their depth, not able to relate to the situation that they would see before their eyes. For the SNP, a lot of the speakers painted a rosy picture, but the reality is that after 13 years, we have public services in crisis. People waiting more than 12 hours in A&Es, class sizes rising, pass rates in key subjects falling. As Pauline McNeill mentioned, homelessness, people dying on the streets of homelessness, the highest rate in the UK, 195 people last year. An appalling train service, where even this morning I received reports of people not able to get on trains and police stations falling down. So the jury's very much out on the SNP as we consider this budget. Let's have a budget that delivers for people, delivers for communities, a budget for public services.
I now call on Kate Forbes for up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Well, despite all the promises that have been made over the last years to end austerity, the UK Government has failed to deliver thus far. And worse, it's increased the uncertainty for Scotland. UK Government budget in October 2018 failed to deliver its promises. UK Government delayed its 2019 budget and instead delivered a lacklustre spending review. And the UK 2019 spending review has been delayed. But we wait in anticipation for this year's budget. And in sharp contrast to that, the Scottish Government has taken unprecedented action to deliver certainty for our public services and local authorities, and full details will be set out by the Cabinet Secretary tomorrow. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is willing to listen to constructive ideas from all sides of the Chamber to pass a Scottish budget to deliver stability for Scotland's economy and public services. And I think we've heard some very thoughtful speeches today that did offer constructive thoughts. Tom Arthur's, Graham Simpson's, John Mason's, and others that highlighted the inherent hypocrisy in the motion before us, Ruth Maguire, Stuart McMillan, Kenny Gibson, Keith Brown and Patrick Harvey. There were some great lines, particularly from James Kelly, who described Budget Day as Christmas Day, Willie Rennie, who repeated that he was confused several times, and Tom Arthur, who rightly acknowledged the Boris bonus for independence polling. Clearly, members have different priorities for tomorrow, some on climate change from Claudia Beamish. Liam Kerr mentioned police and justice, and Dean Lockhart referred to the importance of economic growth. Presiding Officer, costings are important when it comes to budget asks, and I do look forward to seeing the Conservatives' figures, although the A4 page of text doesn't fill me with great confidence, but I will reserve judgment until I have seen the costings that Murdo Fraser agreed to give me. The Tories might have shifted slightly on slashing taxes on the very highest earners to just calling for no divergence in this year's budget, no doubt recognising that the Scottish Government's position on income tax has been far more in line with public opinion than their own ridiculous position over the last few years. The irony, of course, is not lost on me that for the last 2 months, the Tories were in a position of having supported the removal of tax reliefs on businesses and nurseries, to name just two. The business community won't forget that, for all they self-proclaim to champion Scottish business. Willie Rennie's position is somewhat ridiculous. The budget is a critically important process every year that literally keeps the lights on. And I think Willie Rennie, I'm certainly getting the impression that Willie Rennie is so obsessed with independence, he sees it in the budget document even when it's not there. The only block to the budget is the Lib Dems, who every year have prioritised the union over funding for education, infrastructure and everything else, happily.
Willie Rennie.
So can the Finance Secretary guarantee that there will be no spending on independence from the Scottish Government in the next financial year? Can she guarantee that?
Kate Forbes.
I asked Willie Rennie a very simple question earlier, which he couldn't answer, which was where was the independence line in last year's budget? And the irony of the fact is that the budget process is entirely designed to give security and certainty to the thousands of people that work in our public services, to ensure that teachers are paid, doctors are paid, nurses are paid, that our children are educated. That is what the budget process is about. And to make it about the constitutional issue is nothing short of irresponsible when it comes to ensuring that our public services get the investment that they need. So tomorrow is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to deliver certainty and investment for the people of Scotland. In all of the years since 2016, Tories have voted against Scottish Government budgets. That means they voted against the revolutionary expansion of early learning and childcare. They voted against investment in raising attainment in schools. They voted against record high health spend. They voted against mitigating the damaging effects of UK welfare changes. They voted against increased spend in mental health. And as far as I can see,
Dean Lockhart.
We voted against the budget because it made Scotland the highest tax part of the UK. For people earning over £27,000. Does the Minister recognise what the Fraser of Allentown have said, that the SNP's tax increases have not raised additional finance for public services in Scotland?
Kate Forbes.
I was just coming on to say that as far as I can see, the biggest concern that the Tories had with those budgets was that the fact that the budgets did not see tax cuts for the richest, tax cuts for the highest earners, tax cuts for the biggest business. And in a nutshell, Dean Lockhart has summarised the Tory position over the last few budgets, which was that unless there were tax cuts for the biggest businesses and the highest earners, they would not invest in all the areas that this government has been determined to invest in. So I'm more than delighted that this government has not followed Tory ideology in setting previous budgets, and I am delighted to see a change of heart. However, I will take another intervention because this is making it more fun.
Dean Lockhart.
Just to clarify, we voted against tax increases because we said it would damage the economy. Dermot Mackay, earlier today in the Chamber, said that the Scottish economy has underperformed the UK by 5% since the SNP came to power. And in the last year, the Scottish economy is growing at half the rate of the rest of the UK. We warned the SNP that would be the case. You didn't listen to us, and that's why there is economic decline in Scotland.
I'll tell you why there's an economic challenge in Scotland, and business is quite clear on what the biggest issue has been facing them in the last year, and that has been the uncertainty created by his party in the UK government over Brexit. And it's pretty clear from all the business organisations that that has been the reason for the challenge. But we have quoted Fraser Valander Institute, and they've been clear. They've been clear when analysing our tax position that, and I've said it already and I'll say it again, I quote, "We estimate that the Scottish income tax policy raises approximately around £550 million in revenue compared to a policy to set the same tax parameters as in the UK." That is a hard, cold figure that the Tories would see cut from our public services. And so, well,
the Minister's just closing.
So here before us, Presiding Officer, we have a motion that suggests the Tories have suddenly woken up to the budget process and the need to look like a more competent opposition than they've appeared to be over the course of the last year. As I said at the beginning, we are willing to work constructively with all parties and look forward to their welcome of Dermot Mackay's draft budget published tomorrow.
I now call Miles Briggs to close the debate for up to 9 minutes. Please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close today's debate. And I believe we've had a largely useful discussion ahead of the Finance Secretary's imminent budget announcement. And what we've outlined as Scottish Conservatives, I believe, has presented a positive, pragmatic and positive proposal for investment across our public services. As Murdo Fraser outlined, it's important that we understand the financial background to this year's budget. As outlined today, Scotland is set to receive at least £1.1 billion £1.1 billion in additional Barnett consequentials as a result of extra UK government spending. Fraser Allender Institute has said this will account for a 2.1% increase in funding available to ministers. I think that's something you would expect them to welcome. But SNP ministers also need to accept that one of the biggest block, this is now the biggest increase in a block grant and use of resources available to them over the course of this year. In the run-up to the budget, it's also appropriate, I believe, it's an appropriate time to look at how effective SNP ministers and their agencies responsible for overseeing public spending in this country have actually been in ensuring value for money for Scottish taxpayers in public expenditure. Now, sadly, the public sector landscape in Scotland is littered with reports and audits that have contained damning criticism of financial overspends and mismanagement by SNP ministers and other bodies. We had an IT delivery cost increase of 79% since the original business case was made for the Common Agricultural Policy Futures Programme, whilst NHS 24 IT system, long delayed, saw a cost rise of 73%, above the 75.8 million included in the original business case. As Liam Kerr has outlined today, the weak financial leadership of the Scottish Police Authority has now led to warnings they are facing a deficit of £0.2 billion. Numerous NHS health boards have had to be bailed out with loans from Scottish Government ministers, in many cases with little indication of how and when these loans will have to be repaid. And let us not forget that today, as we stand here, half of all mainland NHS health boards are in special measures. Deputy Presiding Officer, if it was not for the record NHS health funding which has come to Scotland over the last decade from UK Conservative ministers, where would SNP ministers have actually got the resources available to them over this time to write off this debt and fund the ever-expanding debts which are stacking up? And perhaps, Deputy Presiding Officer, a totemic symbol of SNP ministers' mismanagement of SNP resources is best symbolised by the new Sick Kids Hospital and the construction project around that. This is a £150 million project, much needed for my constituents and their children and families. A hospital meant to open in 2012, now 8 years delayed. A hospital which has had an additional £80 million spent on enabling works at the site. beyond the deal reached with the actual consortium building it, a further £11.6 million being given to end a contract dispute. And as things stand today, NHS Lothian is now being given an additional £16 million by the Scottish Government to try to refit the hospital, given the concerns surrounding building standards and the ventilation system. These extra costs taken together now mean that a project set to cost the Scottish taxpayer £150 million will cost £520 million over its lifetime. No wonder, Deputy Presiding Officer, that the Edinburgh Evening News has today declared the SNP government's handling of the project as worse than the trams. And there's a growing anger now amongst Edinburgh and Lothian residents that I represent, and Lothian members who are in the chamber, I'm sure, will agree, that we now see a situation where we are paying £1.4 million for a hospital that patients and NHS staff cannot actually use. So it's abundantly clear from these points that SNP ministers and their agencies really need to look at how they are actually robustly financially managing vital taxpayers' money in this country so that we actually deliver value for money for all the taxpayers we represent. Deputy Presiding Officer, my colleagues have talked about some of the extra investment in public services. Maybe the former Transport Minister needs to think about the ferry project if he's talking about failings. But we've been looking at the investments we want to see made across... I don't have the time, just like you didn't have the time. All of us accept that we need to see investment in our health service, and there's no bigger public health emergency than one we see in Scotland today with drug deaths. As I said last week in the debate, we need to be honest and recognise that SNP cuts to drug budgets have destabilised services across our country. So we need to see resourcing of additional capacity to deliver the wraparound care which we all want to see. Scotland's seen a devastating reduction in vital drug rehab beds from 352 in 2007 to just 70 today. So we need to see a rapid reverse of this situation, and that's why we're committing and asking for ministers to invest £15.4 million for a coordinated national drug rehab bed fund and strategy to go with it. Equality in funding is also a key issue which many members have raised around the health service and around our health boards. The Health and Sport Committee budget scrutiny has already demonstrated that there are a number of health boards across Scotland who still are not within NRAC parity. Now, this is a particular issue in my own region here in Lothian, but also I know for North East colleagues who have long advocated a change. As health secretaries have come and go, from Nicola Sturgeon to Alec Neil to Shona Robson to now Jean Freeman, they've been content to stand by and watch our health boards underfunded. I hope the Cabinet Secretary will use the budget to finally end the underfunding of health boards across this country. Despite my region here in Lothian having the fastest growing and ageing population, the lack of parity is seeing our health board underfunded. One of the key reasons outlined just this week when the chairman of NHS Lothian, Brian Houston, handed his resignation letter to the Cabinet Secretary. So we need to see parity, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will deliver just that tomorrow. SNP ministers have the resources. We know that the UK government are providing what is now the single biggest cash injection in the funding of our health service in history. That will give the opportunity for that to be closed. And hospital parking is something which the minister touched upon earlier in her opening speech. And I think it's something we need to actually see tomorrow progress made on as well, because there are additional £7.5 million in Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland due to the fact that in England we'll see the scrapping of parking charges at hospitals. Now, Scottish Conservatives want to see additional resources made available to hospitals across Scotland and want to see a comprehensive review of parking to assess the capacity for the development of a free parking scheme for protected groups, including disabled patients and parents of sick children staying overnight. In addition, we know that there are three hospitals across Scotland where staff are still having to pay parking charges, and that's something we can do something about. So we're calling for a refund scheme to be adapted and for that to cost £2.7 million of the 7.5 coming to ministers. Graham Simpson highlighted some very important points with regards to resources needing to go to councils to help address homelessness, and I endorse these, specifically for us to allow additional resourcing for local authorities for the rapid rehousing transition plans, which was discussed last week. Before concluding, Deputy Presiding Officer, I would like to make and put emphasis really on the concern which I think all of us should be really considering today, and that is that Scotland's economy is projected to grow at the lowest rate in the UK over the next 4 years. That's something none of us will want to see, but it's something ministers here have an opportunity to change. We believe that higher taxes will only risk decreasing economic growth further in Scotland. And in any case, as Murdo Fraser has highlighted correctly, how tax changes and tax rates and bans are not leading to an extra increase in tax take by the government anyway is significant. We will support new measures by SNP ministers to incentivise businesses and bring jobs and growth to Scotland, and a vision that we need to support the development of businesses and the environment in the future to make sure we see the jobs of the future in Scotland. So I hope tomorrow this year's budget can use a more positive financial outlook, which the Cabinet Secretary has in this year's budget, to support our key public services, boost the economy and avoid increased tax levels on all hard-working Scottish families. I support the motion in Murdo Fraser's name.
That concludes the Conservative Party debate on no case for tax increases or further cuts to public spending. And it's now time to move on to the next item of business.